So we're switching gears from basically evolution and the history of life to ecology. And ecology, first of all, in general, ecology and evolution, they're related. In fact, many of the ecological processes we look at, like predation and competition and all those things that affect evolution, are part of ecology. And so it's kind of, ecology is the other side of the coin from evolution. But ecological timescales are generally a lot shorter than evolutionary timescales, which can, in some cases, there's fairly a rapid evolution, especially with bacteria, but as we'll see later, other things as well. But generally, evolution can, can go on millions of years. Evolutionary process like mass extinctions, obviously the effects are felt for millions of years and even billions of years. So very long period of time. Okay. Oh, and ecological timescales are usually a lot shorter. Usually it's like how organisms are interacting with their environment on a daily or hourly or whatever basis. Okay, so we're going to have a little definition here, but first, what's the biosphere? Well, the biosphere consists of all of Earth's organisms plus the physical space we all inhabit. In other words, there's organic and living things in the biosphere. There are also abiotic factors. In other words, things like concentration of oxygen, atmosphere, weather, temperature. If you're in water, how much oxygen is in different layers, the pressure of water. Is it saltier or fresh water? All these kinds of things are part of the biosphere. So here's our biosphere. It's the whole Earth, okay? And essentially, it's just a thin veneer going down maybe a couple of, more than a couple of miles, because we've got some deep sea trenches, but also even in the rock, it goes a couple miles deep. There are actually bacteria deep in what's called the lithosphere, the Earth's crust. Okay. So, what is ecology? It's a study of biotic and abiotic factors interacting. In other words, the interactions between the organisms and their environment. So we've got organisms and we've got an environment. What does it mean for an organism to interact with an environment? How might organisms actually interact? Obviously, getting food, procreating, reproducing, defense mechanisms in terms of what might be being a predator on it, or let's say, like with COVID-19, a parasite or a pathogen. All those things are interacting with the environment. So we usually break the environment down into two components: the biotic factor. Now, biotic factors include all the living things in that environment that an organism is going to interact with. If an organism is, let's say, a gazelle, it's going to interact with the vegetation that it eats. Some of the vegetation it eats, it doesn't eat other kinds of vegetation. Where is it going to hang out in the dark versus the daytime? what is preying on it at that time of year, migration patterns, interacting with other gazelles within the group, social interactions. And then abiotic factors are non-living things like the atmosphere, the air pressure, that changes if you go higher, it gets less. Also, concentration of oxygen goes down. The temperature, precipitation, rocks and things like that. Let's say it's a small animal and it uses holes, little crevices in boulders to hide. That's abiotic factors. Okay. And then environmental factors, of course, affect the distribution and abundance of organisms. So instead of historical, think about why we find polar bears up in the Arctic and not down in South America in the tropic belt, but we do find spectacled bears in the tropics. They're related, of course. They're both part of the bear family, but they all have adaptations for those differences in the environment, which are quite different. So let's think about the classroom. Are there ecological interactions in this classroom? Well, obviously, the classroom has been changed dramatically. In other words, the environment, our classroom environment has changed. Instead of everybody being here, I'm recording this lecture. So what's the biotic classroom environment? Well, there's all kinds of things. There's bacteria, there's viruses, hopefully not COVID, but could be. That's part of the classroom environment. Social interactions among the people, the students. Does any of you have anybody in the classroom who's a good friend of yours? So, who are your friends? Who are the people that you can rely on? Let's say you don't show up to class, but can you get notes or whatever? Who do you not like? That's also part of the social environment. Who are you attracted to? Part of sexual selection. Okay. And then the classroom environment is, well, air and all that, but are the chairs living? Well, they're created by living things, but let's say they're part of the abiotic environment. So why do you choose the seat that you're sitting in? Some of you sit up front. Others of you want to sit in the back. So why do you choose or use the environment in different ways depending on who you are? What is your classroom niche? So a niche is kind of like, in terms of biology and ecology, it's the job of an organism. So let's say a cheetah is a predator, and its job is to eat other animals that it chases, gazelles and things like that. That's like a lawyer. What is a lawyer? Well, a lawyer does law and sells the services. Same sort of thing. So that's a classroom niche. What's a classroom niche? Well, some of you are more likely to ask questions. So there's the student loudmouth niche, and then there's the student shy niche. There's lots of those, and each one of you might have slightly different niches, how you use the environment. And using the environment, including behavior, okay, like where you sit, and then how you interact in the environment with other students and with me. So, the Amazon. Unfortunately, the Amazon is in bad shape. It was already in bad shape, but then Brazil hired or voted in, basically dictator. Hopefully they'll vote him out. but he's been a disaster. And he's basically opened up the Amazon to complete exploitation. So they're cutting it down. Now, the thing is, the Amazon has been referred to as the lungs of the world because of the amount of carbon recycling, namely plants taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and turning it into sugars. And so there's some real questions about what's going to happen with it. So here's a lowland tropical forest. We've got a small creek or river. It's a creek running through it. So abiotic factors, water, but of course water has a lot of biotic factors in it. It not only has living things, but it also has things that living things have added to it, like biotic molecules, like sugars. Let's say an animal falls in, or a plant falls in, a fruit. There's sugars in it. There's some other things in it that other animals might eat. Detritivores might break down, all that kind of stuff. So water is kind of a mixture. It is just plain water. It's an abiotic factor. Even though, of course, all living things have tons of water in it. Then there's rocks, air, more shade. Certain areas are more exposed to the sunshine. And then biotic factors. Where are organisms found? So there's microbes, there's fungi, there's plants, there's animals. Where do the animals hang out? Where are certain plants found compared to other plants that might be? So some of these plants are growing right in the water, like these tree ferns, and others are probably growing more in the terra firma, and especially up in this area. So where are those factors that control or influence where organisms are found? So lists as many biotic factors you can call, plants as well as animals, microscopic bacteria, algae, and all that. Is the forest part of the biotic or abiotic environment? It can be considered both. Is the river part of the it can be also considered both. The algae, the plants, the aquatic organisms. Okay, so this is a coral reef, a tropical coral reef. Probably some of you have seen those if you've gone to Hawaii, things like that. Water temperature, so tropical reefs, of course, are much different than, let's say, temperate marine environments. They're a lot warmer, so the water's hotter. Also, what's the salinity of the water? That's part of abiotic. The depth of the water and the water pressure. And then what makes a tropical reef? Well, it's a reef, but it's basically coral, living and dead. Living on top, dead on the bottom, and so that coral is basically calcium carbonate, so that's abiotic. And then what are living in the reef? Obviously lots of coral, anemones, crustaceans like shrimp and crabs and things like that, cuttlefish or cephalopods, kind of like octopus, clams, more mollusks, fish, sharks, algae, bacteria, plankton. Both phytoplankton that take in sunlight and make and carbon dioxide actually, and turn out through photosynthesis carbohydrates, and then zooplankton that eat those plankton, and all different kinds of fish that start a food chain. Okay. You can read about the Amazon drought. One thing I do want to climate change any large-scale and long-term alteration of the Earth's climate. Okay, so large scale, not small, and long term, not short. So, climate is made up of prevailing weather of a region over relatively longer periods of time, let's say over 30 years. So, for example, there was something called the Little Ice Age. I think it started in the 1300s, and it went until 1850, and it made Europe and Asia much colder than it had been previously. So that's climate. Now, what does that mean? Well, it's made up of the weather, like weather events, fronts moving through. During the wintertime, fronts moving through and dropping lots of snow, and it turns to ice. Cold temperatures. In the summertime, it warms up, but during the Little Ice Age, it didn't warm up very well, and there were long-term consequences. So, organisms are more strongly influenced by climate than any other feature in the environment. If you think about polar bears, they're adapted to very cold climates in the Arctic, or penguins in very cold water in the Antarctic. Tree sloths in South America are only found in very tropical climates, very warm climates, and very wet climates. So weather is short-term atmospheric conditions like the temperature, precipitation, wind, humidity, cloud cover, meteorological events. Consequences of climate change. Well, so climate change is always going on. As you know, about 12,000 years ago, that was the end of the last ice age. During the ice age, it was very, very cold. The climate was much different than it is today. In fact, there were glaciers all the way down to the middle of the Midwest and the prairie states. Obviously, there's no glaciers for miles around now, except in the Rockies, and they're much diminished compared to what they used to be. But we've been undergoing what's called climate change recently, looks like because of burning of fossil fuels. So when you increase fossil fuel burning, you release greenhouse gases, and heat gets trapped from solar radiation, and the atmosphere heats up and the earth heats up, which causes ice caps to melt. Causes droughts, receding glaciers, fire, and let's see, fish die off, it looks like. So all kinds of different consequences. Now, obviously, some consequences are good. If you're living in Greenland, instead of having deep snow for 6 or 7 or 8 months for the year, now you only have deep snow for 2 or 3 months. The climate's warmed up. So great for Greenland, not so much for elsewhere. So, name 2 ways in which climatic changes affect frequency and severity of floods. Changes rainfall patterns and melting ice cause rivers and lakes to overflow and things like that. How does climate change? Well, sea level, because of the glaciers melting. Okay. Okay, so climate change, large-scale and long-term alteration of the Earth's climate, and then global warming. Well, global warming is a kind of climate change. Prior to the last ice age, the Earth was warmer, and then we had massive climate cooling, and that went on during the Pleistocene over and over. So there'd be cooling periods, warming periods, cooling. The last glacial maximum was about 18,000 years ago, and then the ice age, the last ice age, ended 12,000 years ago. Now we're undergoing warming period right now, but it doesn't look like it's from non-human effects. It looks like it's because of human effects, namely the burning of fossil fuels and things, and the cutting of forests. So temperature on Earth, first of all, the warming, where they come from, the sun. Obviously, the angle of the Earth, the sunlight strikes the planet more directly at the equator versus the poles. The angle at which the sun strikes the Earth determines how much energy or heat reaches the surface. So the sun's rays strike more directly at the equator, resulting in warmer temperatures, and much less at the poles, plus even more so because the Earth is, of course, not, it's tilted. Okay. Not dependent on how sunlight strikes the Earth, global warming, caused by an increase in greenhouse gases. So if there's always going to be some greenhouse gases. For example, water is actually, or vapor, water vapor is a greenhouse gas. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, naturally occurring, right? Methane, nitrous oxide. But what's happening is there's kind of a dynamic equilibrium normally where carbon dioxide and water are taken out of the atmosphere or fall out of the atmosphere in terms of water precipitation. Plants transform that carbon dioxide into carbon sequestration in the form of carbohydrates. So it's not floating around anymore, and it's not causing global warming. And then, of course, everything that eats plants releases carbon dioxide, and so there's a natural equilibrium. But we're now digging up and burning fossil fuels that have been taken out of the atmosphere millions of years ago, and we're releasing more than the plants actually can handle. So function greenhouse, of course, if you've seen a greenhouse, it stays warm inside because the glass traps in heat. Same thing happens, let's say, in a car with windows. The car inside, if you leave it, heats up much more rapidly and hotter than, let's say, the outside air. Okay? Some greenhouse effect is actually good. It keeps the temperature of the Earth above what it would, let's say, be without, obviously, the atmosphere. So I want you to watch the animation on the greenhouse effect, and then it also, as well, right now. So, greenhouse gases. So, about a third, you already just saw that video, please, but a third of the incoming solar radiation is reflected back into the space by the atmosphere. Some of the radiation, basically infrared rays, are absorbed by the Earth's surface. Absorbed energy is re-emitted as infrared radiation into the atmosphere, warming the atmosphere. And then some of the infrared radiation is absorbed by greenhouse gases and re-emitted. And this keeps the atmosphere, as actually makes life possible. Without it, the Earth would be very much colder. And then finally, some of the infrared radiation is lost out of space. Okay, when the concentration of greenhouse gases increases, more infrared radiation is absorbed. And then if we burn fossil fuels, so this is the greenhouse effect. Sun's rays strikes the Earth's surface, the atmosphere, the oceans, warms all those things up. Heat is trapped. Greenhouse gases such as CO2 prevent the heat from escaping. So as more energy is retained in the atmosphere, water temperatures increase. Small increases in water temperature can have large-scale changes. Most animals and plants are adapted to specific temperature ranges, and melting of ice at the poles and large glaciers causes ocean levels to rise. The colder it gets, the more water is trapped in the glaciers and the water level falls. So human activities, up until the burning of fossil fuels, well, humans were always emitting. So let's say when fire was discovered by humans and they could burn things like wood, they're of course releasing carbon dioxide and soot and all that. So that's a greenhouse gas. But there weren't a lot of humans, and it was very little compared to the amount of general carbon dioxide that was released by all animals and all living things, including the things that broke things down like fungi and bacteria. But once we started getting fossil fuels, which have much more energy per volume and per mass, a lot of these greenhouse fossil fuels they were first actually buried and made millions of years ago, let's say 300 million years ago. And so coal fields, petroleum, liquid petroleum, natural gas, all those kinds of things. And so we started burning those things when we got access to them. You can see the red circles. Oh, that's okay. Green circles indicate CO2 levels measured from bubbles of air trapped in the ice. So actually we have ice cores actually that go, some ice that goes back to, I think, 800,000 years ago. But this only goes back to 1,000, and we can see what the CO2 level was in parts per million. And it wasn't until 1900s and 2000s that levels of greenhouse gases started to really rise from the burning of fossil fuels. So the effects of global warming. So average global temperature between 1880 and 2016. Now, obviously, there's a variation because of the time of year, and this is average global, but you can certainly put a trend line through it. And you can see that it went from, let's say, around 56.5 up to 58.5. That's 2 degrees Celsius or Fahrenheit over that period of time. Also, so that's temperature. And then when temperature goes up, you also have higher frequency of fire because things dry out faster and are able to burn. Carbon dioxide during this time period, or from, okay, so from 1960 to 2010, again, concentration parts per million, it's gone from, in 1960, about 320 parts to, actually, 2020, it's almost up to 400 parts per million. Okay, so increasing greenhouse gases. So temperature and carbon dioxide concentration, we can see, are tightly correlated. The CO2 concentration is in the red, and the temperature is in the blue. And as temperature goes up, CO2 goes up. As temperature goes down, CO2 goes down. Temperature goes up, and then down, so on. Temperature goes way up. We get a spike as well. So 400,000 years before the present, you can see that there have been differences in carbon dioxide concentration over time. So temperature and CO2. So there's been times when it's been up to like 360, but it's above 380 now. So before and after the Amazon drought, you can see what happened. And the Amazon actually burned. You can read about this. Unfortunately, like I said, Bolsonaro, the president of Brazil, is a madman, and he's basically opened the Amazon completely, and there's all kinds of terrible things happening. So you can actually look at how things have changed over time. You can see the amount of forest deforested in yellow, dry and logged forest, and non-forested. So if global warming increases, dry areas will likely increase as well. Okay. So, hydraulic cycle. That's the water cycle. In other words, water, first of all, 3/4 of the planet is covered in water, mostly oceans. And then there's terrestrial environments, and water evaporates from surface water and enters the atmosphere, and then at certain points it precipitates out of the atmosphere, either back into the ocean or onto land. So this cycle goes around and around. So the hydrologic cycle. Arrows point toward the atmosphere, show where the evaporation occurs from water sources or is released from plants. So if you would please look at the video in animations, same place as before, the one from greenhouse gases. That's animations chapter 18, and then we can go on from here. Okay, so if you've watched that, you understand this graph. Most of the water, of course, is in the oceans. The Earth is covered in oceans, 3/4. Water from the oceans, when it's heated up, is released into the atmosphere as water vapor, and then it moves on the winds. Also, so that's evaporation. There's also groundwater in rivers and underground, and this water is taken up by plants, and plants take water from the ground and use it for moving things around, fluids, and all kinds of different things, and also use it in photosynthesis. And so there's lots of transpiration, water release from the ground into the atmosphere. And then, of course, let's say air with lots of water in it, if it cools down, it's going to start precipitating out into the form of rain or snow or something like that. Okay. So you've watched that animation. So Earth has four giant, basically convection cells that, in this instance, it's the winds that actually move air around and is driven by differences in heat and moisture in the atmosphere. So warm, moist air rises and cools. So in cell 1, during the tropics, it very warm, moist air rises, and a lot of it falls right there. Warm, moist air cools as it rises, causing rainfall. And then some of it is carried away, either if you're north of equator, going towards the north, or some of it is dropped as rainfall. Some of the cool air sinks and then is deflected both north and south. The clash of moist, warm tropical air and cold fronts produces rain. And then cool, dry air sinks. And in case you don't know it, even if you think about the Arctic, it's obviously covered in snow and ice and things like that. You would think that there's lots of precipitation, but there's not. There's actually very little precipitation. Most of the air that gets the poles has already lost most of its water to precipitation. Convection cells in the angle of sunlight striking the earth create these regional different environments in terms of regional climate environments. So we have tropical rainforest, we have deciduous rainforest, we have let's see, what is it? Like pine forest and things like that. Deserts, grasslands, tundra, all that kind of stuff. So the global carbon cycle, as you saw in the video, transfers carbon within biotic communities and their surroundings. And carbon is transferred between the biotic and abiotic environments. Photosynthesis, so sunlight, water, and CO2 become sugar and oxygen. Respiration takes up O2 and releases CO2 back, and also releases water. And then combustion, which is much like respiration, but it happens faster. So if you remember, photosynthesis takes CO2 and H2O, turns it into sugars and oxygen. That's cellular respiration, the Krebs cycle. And then the citric acid cycle is the reverse. That's, that's glucose, that's cellular respiration, is the Krebs cycle. And then photosynthesis is the citric acid cycle. So then respiration, you break down sugars and you use oxygen and you release CO2 and H2O. And you can see how the carbon cycle works, with the sun providing the energy that the plants and phytoplankton turn into sugars. So when you cut down forest, deforestation decreases the CO2 sink. So forests, by their very nature, take carbon dioxide out of the air. So they're called CO2 sinks instead of a source. So you have, here's trees, right? And here's CO2, and CO2, and the plants take CO2 out of the atmosphere. Those go away and turn them into sugars. That ants eat. Okay. So burning of plants and fossil fuels create CO2. That means they become CO2 sources. Okay, so there's CO2 sinks that take CO2 out of the atmosphere, and then there's CO2 sources that put CO2 back into the atmosphere. Okay. Okay, so here we have the carbon cycle again. Natural pathways are in purple, and those from human activity are in red. So, photosynthesis takes carbon dioxide and puts it into plants, and plants turn it into sugars and release oxygen. Okay. And then, of course, animals eat plants. Also, animals are eaten by decomposers, and plants are eaten by decomposers as well. Okay? And then, through cellular respiration, photosynthesis, respiration, carbon dioxide is released into the atmosphere. Okay. So, green organisms, photosynthesis, taking carbon dioxide out, releasing it into the ocean. Then, when we actually do fossil fuels, we're actually accessing all this fossil fuels, whether it's coal, peat bogs, oil, gas, natural gas, all those kinds of things. We extract that, we transport it, we use it for agriculture, and we burn it for energy. Lots and lots of energy. And that's carbon dioxide being released into the atmosphere. So photosynthesis takes it out, and respiration releases it, and carbon dioxide release and burning. So carbon sinks, a natural or artificial reservoir that absorbs more carbon. In other words, more carbon than it releases. So a good example is the Amazon absorbs 1.5 billion tons of carbon dioxide, I think, over a year, maybe more. So this slows climate change. It takes carbon dioxide. It reduces the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Normally, there's a kind of a equilibrium between carbon sinks and carbon sources. Carbon sources, natural or artificial reservoir that releases more carbon than it absorbs. In 2005, a drought, the Amazon trees died and rotted. That releases rotting, that cellular respiration releases. And so the rainforest was not only releasing carbon dioxide, but now wasn't also sequestering carbon or becoming a carbon sink. So this is juniper woodland, and you can see that juniper woodland, the trees, small trees, they're a carbon source. They give off more CO2 than they absorb. But when you burn them, because they've got all this carbon in them, namely in the form of sugars and cellulose and all that, that then releases carbon. So normally they're a carbon sink, but if they burn, they're a carbon source. So how big is your ecological footprint? So think of how much of the Earth's resources that you actually use, including the carbon, the water, the air, all that kind of stuff. And your ecological footprint is often expressed in Earth equivalents, which we'll look at. The number of planet Earths needed to provide the resources and absorb the waste of an individual or a population. An action, if possible, is sustainable. It can be continued indefinitely. In other words, the amount you use is the amount that's also, by photosynthesis and things like that, put back into the atmosphere and the planet. Unfortunately, especially more developed nations is much more so. We used a lot more carbon or Earth equivalents than we actually put back in. So it's not sustainable. So the footprint, it would take nearly 5 planet Earths to support human population and everyone on Earth enjoy the same lifestyle. Okay. So your ecological footprint depends on carbon footprint, how much energy is used, namely in food and all the other things like driving a car. Food footprint, land and energy and water it takes to grow what you eat and drink. Built up land footprint, including buildings and infrastructure, goods and services. The U.S. Is the biggest user of Earth equivalents, as you can see. I think by now, actually, China is moved up.